Ladies and gentlemen, Shimano recently released the Deore 12-speed mountain bike drivetrain. So now they have 4 high-end 12-speed mountain bike drivetrains, and today we are going to go in depth in what is the actual difference between all of them. So probably most of you already know that Deore is the least expensive and XTR is the most expensive, but what do you get for your money when you go from one to the next drivetrain? We're going to dive into every little aspect of that right now. As many of you know, the mountain bike industry is pretty consistent with the fact that the more money you spend, the lighter weight things get and the more feature-rich things get. And that is the name of the game with drivetrains and basically anything else in the mountain bike world, and it's really kind of the same thing here. So to gloss over real quick, you have Deore at $295 for a 5-piece groupo, $388 for SLX, $603 for XT, and $1,350 for XTR. Very, very significant differences in the price points of these group sets. So what really is the difference between them? Kind of what this boils down to, well, before we get into the nitty-gritty,
let's get down to the nitty-gritty.
These things all shift absolutely incredible. So Shimano and SRAM have been making drivetrains for a couple decades or way more now, and they shift amazing, they work amazing, they're the two best brands, and it's super high quality. So there really is, in my opinion, no noticeable performance difference between any of these, and neither is there with SRAM drivetrains. So the entry-level stuff is going to shift crisp and snappy and really well as long as it's adjusted and assembled correctly, just like the really high-end stuff. You might notice something that's a little bit less tangible, and that's kind of the feel, right? So there is going to be materials differences, and that kind of boils down into the weight differences as well. Those material differences, which are just higher quality materials, tighter tolerances, those are going to make the things just shift and feel snappier and just more expensive. You can kind of tell that. So that's just, if you were to do a blindfold test, aside from the noticeable different features on some of them, which are nothing huge, but there are some differences in features we'll get into, the actual just feel, the way that thing shifts, the flex in the shifter lever, the way you hear the chain move from the cassette cog to the next one, there's a little bit difference there that you can kind of just tell is more quality and lighter weight on the really high-end stuff versus the slightly lesser expensive stuff. And that's kind of the name of the game with this stuff. So to dial a little bit more into what is the differences between these things other than features and weight, right off the bat, a couple like really noticeable things with Shimano drivetrains that to me is like, oh wow, this is pretty significant, is the actual shifter functionality. The Deore and the SLX, the downshift, so to get to a harder gear, when you're using the thumb lever, you only get one shift at a time. So that's a single click on the downshift. Whereas the XT and the XTR, this is actually a really nice feature. When you push the thumb actuated lever, you get 2 clicks. That is seemingly might be like, oh, who cares? But it's pretty nice. It's actually, you know, when you're pedaling up a hill and then all of a sudden it just pitches down really quick, to just knock that chain down further down the cassette as quick as you can, being able to do that like double downshift is pretty awesome and a really nice feature. And that's only available on XT and XTR, but not on Deore and SLX. So that is one of the key features that is different and noticeable right away when you're to ride these things. The other, a little bit more noticeable one is the adjustability of the derailleur. So all of these derailleurs, the way Shimano's work, you can turn on or off your derailleur clutch, right? So that derailleur clutch is what makes it nice and frictiony when the derailleur cage is moving like this. That keeps your chain from falling off, etc. When you take your wheel off, you don't want it like that because it's hard to get your wheel off, so you flick this lever right here, boom, now it's nice and smooth and you can get your wheel on and off. So that's what that lever is there for. That lever is apparent on all of these derailleurs. One of the differences though, the Deore and SLX do not have the ability to adjust the friction of that clutch without taking off this entire cap. So in case you were wondering this, since this is a pretty new drivetrain, the Deore drivetrain, we did check all this. if you pull this cap off, you can still adjust, which is a really cool feature of Shimano derailleurs. You can adjust the tension of that clutch with a 2mm Allen. But in order to do that, you have to take off this whole lid, which is 3 2mm Allen bolts, to just open this thing up and adjust that. And that's the same way it is on SLX as well. Once you step up price point wise to XT and XTR, you don't need to take off that whole lid. You've got a little dust cover cap that you pull off right here, and there's a 2mm Allen head in there that you can just adjust right there, pretty much on the fly, right? It's a lot easier to do it because you just pull off this cap and boom, you can adjust the tension of that clutch. Why you would ever want to do that? Well, those clutches it's a friction component, right? So over time it does wear out, and you want to tighten it up a little bit as the derailleur ages, but some people just have a preference, right? It will shift a bit smoother with the clutch having less friction, but it will make less noise and have more likelihood of the chain actually staying on with the clutch being tighter and there being more friction. So it is a little bit personal preference, right? If you're riding cross-country trails that are not very rough, you might want to loosen that clutch a bit so it shifts really smooth and buttery and feels really nice that way and doesn't wear out as quickly. If you're riding more chunky, sort of burlier stuff, you might want to adjust that clutch to be nice and tight so that way it makes less noise and you have less likelihood of that chain falling off or the thing ghost shifting when you're in really, really rough terrain and the derailleur is slapping all around.
I slapped the bass big time.
So those are, between the double downshift on the shifters on these guys, XT and XTR, and the adjustable clutches, the derailleur clutches, not having to take off the whole lid, those are kind of the two major feature differences between the Deore and SLX versus the XT and XTR. Last one, XTR only. This uses a different system to actually get your bottom bracket the correct bearing tension. So this has a built-in expansion ring on here, which is really nice, and it doesn't use pinch bolts. Good, very sleek design, also saves weight. Again, weight is obviously getting lower as we go across the board. We'll get more into weights in a little bit. But this design is much more mechanic friendly and nicer to work on and just a more high quality futuristic design. Whereas currently on the XT and below, you've got more of the traditional, it's got a dual 5mm pinch bolt design with a little plastic thing that locks over it. And this is kind of how Shimano cranks have been for quite some years now. It's not as light, it's not as mechanic friendly, it's not as quick. It's equally just as adjustable, and once you get it all dialed in, it's kind of the same. But weight-wise, mechanic friendliness, and looks, these are a little bit lesser on this end, and the highest end stuff, XTR, you do get that feature. So now let's dive in a little bit to the weights, now that we've kind of covered the feature differences. Alcohol's the wonder drug. So let's talk about weight and weight mixed in with price point. We weighed all of these components individually on our own scale, so they are our actual recorded weights, and we have photos of that, so we didn't mess it up. Shimano is very, very complicated in their model names, their part numbers, and weird things like OEM only products or releasing certain stuff in North America and not Europe or vice versa. So if anything seems very strange, it could be something like that, or maybe we just messed something up, but we've done our best to really make sure we get actual weights of all of these new modern 12-speed Shimano group sets. By the way, I didn't mention earlier, all of these things use a 10 to 51 cassette, every one of these drivetrains, and it all uses now the Shimano proprietary micro spline free hub body. So keep that in mind for any of these newer generation Shimano 12-speed group sets. So let's talk about weight. Deore 5-speed group set versus the SLX. So there is a 229 gram weight difference, and you're getting 229 grams for basically 93 bucks difference. Moving over, SLX to XT, it's only a 75 gram weight difference for a $215 price jump. But remember, SLX to XT does have a couple features that are important to remember there. One is that double downshift on the shifter, and the other one is that ability to adjust the clutch on the derailleur without having to take the whole lid off. So pretty significant change there. XT to XTR is where things get a little bit more interesting. 247 gram weight difference. Pretty significant. Remember, a pound for those Americans is 454 grams. So a pretty significant weight difference between XT and XTR. However, the price jump is $747. So quite a bit difference. And really the only feature that you're getting is a hollow pin chain and basically the bottom bracket preload on the crank design. Those are the features. Keep in mind, of course, the materials are different. And that's what is making that weight difference, 247 grams. So materials are different, it is much lighter, but noticeable features, it's really pretty minimal, right? So that gives you a little bit more understanding there. If you want to see this chart and sort of an even more extensive breakdown, check the link below in the video description to our blog article on this, where we're going to break this down a lot more and have a lot more images on every single one of these individual components sitting on our own scale and the whole chart and everything like that for you guys if you want to get even more into the nitty-gritty between the differences of these drivetrains. So it's pretty interesting what's going on here. Another thing that I should note and mention that a lot of people are probably going to talk about, and I glossed over this earlier, but the feel of these drivetrains, right? A lot of what you feel in a drivetrain are kind of the actual tactile feel of that shifter when you shift, what it feels like when the chain hops over from one cassette cog to the next. Those are things you're going to feel. The other things you're going to feel are the flex in the cranks, right? How flexy are the cranks? Every crank has some amount of flex to it. Shimano, for some reason, I'm not 100% positive why, has totally steered away from carbon in their cranks, I think forever. I don't think they've ever made a carbon crank, maybe ages ago, but none of these are carbon, whereas every other drivetrain brand and other component brand is making carbon cranks. Shimano, they're not a fan of carbon.
No, this can't happen!
They're just sticking with alloy cranks. But obviously the cranksets do get considerably lighter, right? So let's take a look at, you have a Deore crankset with a 32-tooth chainring, 780 grams, SLX at 624. XT, our weight was actually 10 grams more for the XT. Go figure. XTR, 541 grams. So that's a super light crank. Is it stiffer? I think it's supposed to be stiffer.
That's what she said.
The reason I'm not going to tell you it's stiffer is because I've never scientifically put these things on a scale to actually test the torsional flex of the things. And I can't confidently tell you that I would notice a difference if I was blindfolded between a Deore crank and an SLX crank or an XTR crank. Is there a difference if you put them on a machine? Maybe there is. There's obviously a weight difference, but is it actually stiffer and lighter? I don't know. I can't confidently tell you the answer to that. I think, that's kind of the claimed theory out there, is that the cranks get lighter and stiffer as they get more expensive in the Shimano realm and just kind of in cranks in general. But once again, I'm not going to lie to you guys and say that there's a huge noticeable difference in the actual feeling of the cranks between these things. There obviously is. If you pick these things up in your hand, you're like, oh, holy crap, this one's a lot lighter than the other. But there you go. That's it with cranks. Other than that, this chart that you guys are looking at right now that gives you the broken down weights of every single component and the individual price of every single component should be sort of a guiding light where it would help you sort of come to your own conclusion. How much are you willing to pay for those features that I mentioned? How much are you willing to pay for the weight savings that you get as you sort of go from Deore all the way up to XTR? It's a personal preference. And how much do you just kind of like the beautiful looks of XTR? So obviously, that is another aesthetic part of this whole equation, is the less expensive stuff. Does it look as fancy as the XTR? I don't think so. I think the XTR looks fancier. Not to say Deore looks bad or any of these group sets look bad. The Deore actually has a really cool, it's kind of like an oil slick, but it's basically the way that they laser etch the logos on there and you kind of flash it around in the light. You can kind of get some green and purple on the logos. It looks really nice. It doesn't look as fancy as XTR for sure. That just looks like straight up bike bling jewelry. But, to each their own on that sort of thing. So hopefully that gives you guys a bit of a difference. A bit of an idea between the difference of all of these four group sets. At the end of the day, they're pretty similar, right? So the price point is significantly different. So you have a $1,054 difference in price from a 5-piece Deore Groupo to an XTR 5-piece Groupo. That's a huge price jump. And yeah, there's a weight difference, there is some feature difference, but at the end of the day, Deore shifts amazing and it works great, and it's a really high quality drivetrain. And you know, as you go up the ladder, I wouldn't say there's like diminishing returns, but between XT and XTR, major difference, I don't know, a little bit in weight for sure, a little bit in prestige factor for sure. All these things are great, and there's definitely sort of minimal differences between all of them, but all of them at this point, you know, mountain bike drivetrains have evolved a long way. Shimano's been making them, I think, longer than anyone, and they work really well. So hopefully this video gave you guys a little bit of a, you know, more context on sort of what the difference is between all these things. I'm stoked that we were able to compare these and that Shimano finally stepped up and now has the Deore 12 speed, because it's taken long enough for them to come out with a good 12 speed and sort of that sub $300 price point for a five-piece Grupo. But yeah, there it is. If you guys want to subscribe to this channel, I'd really appreciate it. We produce a lot more cool mountain bike content like this, and that's all I got for you today. See you next time.